Welcome to the Arlington Street Church podcast. Founded in 1729, Arlington Street continues today as a gathering place for progressive people of faith in the greater Boston area and beyond. We are located at the corner of Arlington and Boylston Streets, across from the Public Garden in Boston, Massachusetts. Please visit ascboston.org for more information about this historic Unitarian Universalist congregation. Arlington Street Church, gathered in love and service for justice and peace.
First, we make our habits, and then our habits make us. James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, writes, "Your life today is essentially the sum of your habits. What we repeatedly do, what we spend our time thinking about and doing each day, forms our personality, the things we believe, and ultimately, who we are. We are our habits." One evening, as she was preparing dinner, Beverly Pauley mentioned to her husband, Eugene, that their son Michael was coming over to join them. "Who's Michael?" Eugene asked. "Your child," answered Beverly, "you know, the one we raised." Eugene looked at her blankly. "Who's that?" he asked. This turned out to be the first sign that Eugene had contracted encephalitis. The virus had reached his brain and had already begun inflicting catastrophic damage on the delicate folds of tissue where thoughts and dreams and memory are made. The onset of a raging fever sent Eugene into a coma for 10 days. Seemingly miraculously, he emerged with his nervous system intact. He could move his limbs and was responsive to light and noise. But the virus had destroyed a walnut-sized oval of his brain, the place where short-term memory resides. Eugene was 71 years old, but he didn't remember anything from after the time he was 42. And he couldn't remember new information for more than 1 minute. Some mornings he would get out of bed, cook himself bacon and eggs, then climb back under the covers. 40 minutes later, he'd get up and make himself a second breakfast, and go back to bed, and then he'd do it again. The Pauleys moved to San Diego to be closer to their daughter. Eugene was completely disoriented. Eugene's doctors had warned that he would have to be monitored at all times. If he got out, he would never be able to find his way home, let alone tell anyone where he lived. Beverly took him for a walk each day, always along the same route, hoping to familiarize him with his new neighborhood. But then one day, while she was in another room, he wandered out on his own. Beverly was frantic and ran outside to look for him. He was gone. Finally, circling back to the house, she found him sitting in front of the TV watching, ironically, the History Channel. Her tears confused Eugene. He didn't remember leaving, and he couldn't fathom why she was upset. Then Beverly saw a pile of pine cones on the table. Eugene's fingers were sticky with sap. He had indeed moseyed on down the street and picked up some souvenirs and found his way home. Even without the capacity for memory, Eugene had learned a new habit. As it turns out, this was the beginning of a breakthrough in the study of habit. The science is fascinating. When we're learning something new, our brains light up, working on full power as they analyze each new sound, sight, scent, sensation. But as the activity is repeated, a part of the brain called the basal ganglia stores our habits. Our brains are constantly looking for ways to save effort. They'll make any routine into a habit. As the rest of the brain quiets down, the basal ganglia proceeds on autopilot. Every day we rely on hundreds of cues from the basal ganglia. Unthinking, we hit the snooze button, squeeze toothpaste onto our toothbrush, put on our socks before our shoes. Most of us perform an intricate ballet every morning without a thought. Habit frees our brains to chase other thoughts as we waltz on out into the days. A habit is processed in a 4-step loop. It begins with a cue, a trigger that powers down our brains and lets us go on autopilot. That's followed by craving, physical, mental, or emotional. Next comes the response, what we do about the craving. And finally, there's the reward, the payoff, which is really what it's all about, and reinforces the habit, signaling the brain that it can stop making decisions. Cue, craving, response, reward. Cue, craving, response, reward, over and over. In Eugene Pauly's case, despite severe brain damage, that loop was still at work. The basal ganglia had escaped the ravages of encephalitis. Habit enabled Eugene to continue to live in his home and happily. Even though that he couldn't remember he'd already eaten breakfast, he still knew how to make it and eat it. Even though he had no idea where he was, he could make his way home from his morning walk. His doctor, Larry Squire, says, "All my life I was fascinated by memory. And then I met Eugene and saw how rich life can be, even if you can't remember it. The brain has this amazing ability to find happiness, even when the memories of it are gone." Now to the heart of this sermon. The bad news is that the brain cannot tell the difference between bad habits and good ones. Habits are formed without our permission, and they never disappear. Habits are encoded into the structure of our brains. Once we've learned them, they're in there somewhere, waiting to be reignited. The good news is that habits can be ignored, changed, or replaced. When we understand how they're formed, cue, craving, response, reward, we can make a decision to jump on or jump off the habit loop. And right about now, in these first days of January, is a really good time to re-examine our habits. So it's important to understand that everything is geared to the reward. We begin with the end in sight. To get there, there's that cue that triggers our brain to initiate the habitual behavior that precedes that reward and predicts it. And then craving kicks in. What we crave is the change delivered by the habit. So gamblers don't crave the cacophony of the casino, they crave the rush of the jackpot. Smokers don't crave smoking itself, they crave the feelings associated with smoking that provide a respite and relief from the present. No one craves the act of turning on the TV. They want to be entertained. The response to the craving is buying poker chips, lighting up, powering up the remote, whatever we have to do to ignite that habit. And then there's the reward. And again, it is always all about the reward. The cue is about noting the reward. The craving is about wanting the reward. The response is about obtaining the reward. Rewards deliver relief. And rewards teach us which actions are worth remembering in the future and which should become a habit. As Americans became wealthier, we began buying larger amounts of processed sugary foods. But hardly anyone in this country used to brush their teeth. When the government started drafting men to serve in World War I, so many recruits had ruined teeth that poor dental hygiene was listed as a national security risk. Perhaps the greatest advertising executive of the last century, Claude C. Hopkins, revolutionized dental hygiene in America when he created a craving for a minty, frothy toothpaste called Pepsodent. We might imagine that the reward he promised was the Pepsodent smile, but we'd be wrong. It turned out that Pepsodent, unlike other toothpastes at the time, contained citric acid and mint oil, basically irritants. When you finished brushing with it, there was this cool, tingling sensation on the tongue. As it turns out, Claude Hopkins wasn't selling beautiful teeth. He was selling a sensation. Before it appeared, only 7% of Americans had a tube of toothpaste in their medicine chests. 10 years after Hopkins' campaign went nationwide, that number jumped to 65%. By the end of World War II, soldiers' teeth were no longer a concern. And for 30 years, Pepsodent was America's best-selling toothpaste. Today, all toothpaste contained additives whose sole job is to make your mouth tingle after you brush. The tingling doesn't do anything but convince us that the toothpaste is doing its job and reinforce the habit of brushing our teeth. So how do we replicate this phenomenon in our own lives? How do we break into new cue, craving, response, reward cycles? Or how do we break out? Remember, reward drives habit. It's all about the payoff. So let's start by asking ourselves what a really fabulous reward would be. Be very specific. And then spark that craving. How can we make the craving for that reward irresistible? The craving will drive our habit loop. And then ask, how can I make the cue obvious? Inversely, if we want to eliminate a habit, we need to eliminate the cue, so the habit loop will never start. If the craving is met in another way, we won't be motivated to act. If we find another way to be rewarded, we'll quit the old habit. Although the roots of our bad habits may be complex and deep-seated, the research reveals that bad habits all come down to two things: stress and boredom. A key to replacing bad habits with good ones is learning better ways to mitigate our stress and boredom. And beyond that, here's the to-do list. It has 4 items. First, visualize yourself succeeding. Waking up early, eating clean food, being a non-smoker, being fit, whatever it is that you want. Build an identity you love from the inside out. And remember, there was a time we didn't have the bad habits we have. We can think of this as returning to being healthy, returning to the best version of ourselves. Second, eliminate old triggers. If you can't stop after a cookie or two, avoid bakeries and don't have sweets in the house. If you smoke when you drink, ask a friend to meet you somewhere other than a bar. If you click on the TV the moment you plop down on the couch, put the remote on a high shelf in a different room and put a good book within reach. Change your environment to change the outcome. Third, choose new triggers. Instead of eating something you'll regret, call a friend. Choose connection. Instead of cracking open another beer, drop to the floor and do some push-ups. Choose fabulous arms. Instead of buying yet another useless object you don't need, open Instagram and look at amazing photos. Choose beauty and save up to travel. And fourth, join forces. Quit together or start something together. Hold each other accountable, show up for each other, and celebrate your victories. Use social media to find people who want to live the way you want to live. And start living. For those of you who are familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs, you will recognize these strategies. Alcoholism, of course, is much more than a habit. It's a physical addiction, a disease with psychological and often genetic roots. But AA doesn't really address the disease. It addresses diseased behavior. Charles Duhigg, author of The Power of Habit, writes, "What AA provides is a method for attacking the habits that surround alcohol use. It is, in essence, a giant machine for changing habit loops." In fact, AA succeeds because it helps alcoholics use the same cues and get the same reward, but it shifts that inner part, the craving and the response. Specifically, step 4, making a searching and fearless inventory of ourselves, is actually creating a list of all the cues, the triggers that make us drink to excess. Step 5, admitting the exact nature of our wrongs, is a way of looking hard at all the ways and all the times everything spiraled out of control. Being drunk rarely makes the reward list for alcoholics. What they crave is relaxation, the blunting of anxiety, escape, emotional release, and sometimes companionship. The physical effects are often the least rewarding part of intoxication. AA offers all of this in the form of meetings and the companionship of a sponsor. No matter how long they've been sober, any alcoholic knows that they are only one drink away from being back in the mess and the mayhem. The old cues and rewards, trigger and payoff are permanently wired in, just waiting to be activated. Only by changing the craving and the response can the habit loop be remade. Nathan Azrin, one of the developers of habit reversal training, says, "It seems like it should be more complex. The truth is, the brain can be reprogrammed. You just have to be deliberate about it." There's just one more thing to add to this mix for now. Belief. Scientists hate this part because belief is not a testable hypothesis. Scott Tonigan, a researcher at the University of New Mexico, says, "I wouldn't have said this even a year ago. That's how fast our understanding is changing." But belief seems critical. You don't have to believe in God. But you do need the capacity to believe that things will get better. It turns out that the people who have the most success in recovering from addiction, replacing self-destructive habits with life-giving ones, come to believe that they can cope with the challenges of living without their fix. Believe they can get better. Believe in a program of recovery. We might even consider believing that there's something at work in our lives that's more powerful than the person who's looking back at us when we gaze into the mirror. Leanne Kaskutis, a senior scientist at the Alcohol Research Group, adds, "There's something really powerful about groups and shared experiences. We might be skeptical about our ability to change if we're by ourselves, but a group coming together to help one another change will convince us to suspend disbelief. A community, especially a spiritual community, creates belief. Beloved spiritual companions, first we make our habits, cue, craving, response, reward. And then our habits make us. Let's begin a good habit or end a bad one. Start with payoff. Visualize yourself succeeding. Consider triggers. Out with the old and in with the new. And figure out what's going on in between. Join forces. Start living. Together, may we suspend disbelief and come to believe that things can and will get better. Believe in our power to change our lives and our world for good. Let's make our lives tingle. Amen. And let's join hands for the benediction. From Rainer Maria Rilke. And now, let us believe in the new year that is given us. New, untouched, full of things that have never been. Let's keep the faith and pass it on. The service begins when the service ends. Happy New Year. Bless your hearts. Amen.
Please visit ascboston.org for more information about this historic Unitarian Universalist congregation. Arlington Street Church, gathered in love and service for justice and peace.